The universe did not announce the arrival of legends. It simply made room for them. Deep Space Nine hung in the black like an iron wheel against the stars, its Cardassian architecture brooding and utilitarian. A monument to occupation repurposed into something resembling hope. Commander, now Captain, Benjamin Sisko stood at the viewport of his office, hands clasped behind his back, watching the wormhole pulse with its familiar blue-white light. It was a quiet morning by the station standards. A Bajoran freighter was clearing the docking ring. Chief O'Brien had filed 3 separate maintenance reports before breakfast. Constable Odo had arrested a Ferengi for the 7th time this week. Then the sensors screamed. Not the measured alert of a Dominion probe. Not the rhythmic warning of an approaching vessel dropping from warp. Something else entirely, a sounder. Stations Cardassian designed. Alert systems had no proper classification for. Lieutenant Commander Worf was the first to speak, his voice carrying that particular Klingon restraint that meant he was genuinely alarmed. Captain, 2 vessels have appeared off the port docking pylon. No warp signature detected. No subspace displacement. They simply appeared. Sisko was on the bridge in 40 seconds. What the view screen showed him defied easy categorization. 2 warships, massive, unfamiliar, bearing hull designs that belonged to no known species, drifted in formation, approximately 4 kilometers, off the station's outer ring. They were not Dominion. They were not Borg. They were not Romulan or Cardassian or any of the 17. Threat profiles Starfleet had loaded into DS9's tactical computer following the Dominion War. They were something else. Something older in aesthetic, almost baroque in their construction, with long sweeping hull lines that suggested a culture that still believed warships should look like weapons. One was white, sleek, almost elegant, its prow cut like a blade through the vacuum. Running lights pulsed along its flanks in patterns that Dax's console could not decode into any standard communication frequency. The other was darker, not in color but in character. A vessel that had clearly seen combat, its hull bearing the faint scoring of weapons fire recently repaired, carrying itself with the quiet dignity of a ship that had survived. Things it probably shouldn't have. Hailing frequencies, Sisko said. Open, Kira replied. But, Captain, Universal Translator isn't finding a match. Whatever language they're broadcasting, it's not in any Federation database. Not even a root linguistic family. Sisko studied the ships for a long moment. 20 years of Starfleet instinct told him these were not explorers. The way the vessels had positioned themselves, the white ship slightly forward, the darker one angled 40 degrees to starboard, was a tactical formation. Whoever was commanding these ships had placed them, unconsciously or deliberately, in a configuration that covered each other's blind spots and gave both vessels optimal firing arcs on the station. These were military minds aboard military ships. Get me Dax, he said quietly, and alert Dr. Bashir that we may have need of his diplomatic patience. Aboard the Brunhild, the silence that followed. The jump was the silence of men who had stared death in the face and were annoyed to find themselves still breathing. Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengram stood at the center of his command bridge, golden hair catching the light of stars he did not recognize, and felt something he had not felt since childhood. Disorientation. He did not show it. He never showed anything he did not choose to show. His expression remained what it always was, cool, imperious, the face of a man who had seized an empire through sheer force of will and genius and was not accustomed to finding the universe uncooperative. But his eyes moved. Across the unfamiliar star charts his navigation officers were desperately trying to compile, and something cold settled in his chest. Oberstein. His voice was quiet, the quiet that his officers had learned to treat as more dangerous than shouting. Admiral. Paul von Oberstein materialized at his shoulder with the silent efficiency that made most men uncomfortable and Reinhard merely grateful. Preliminary stellar cartography matches nothing in our database. Constellation patterns suggest we are approximately. He paused, and even Oberstein's mechanical precision faltered slightly, in an entirely different region of space than any our civilization has charted. The corridor. Yes. The warp corridor at Vermilion. The energy readings before transit were unlike anything our physics models predicted. It appears we have not simply jumped to another location. Obersteins. Artificial, I caught the light. We appear to have jumped to another universe. Reinhard was quiet for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he processed the tactical situation. With the speed that had made him a marshal at 20 and an emperor before 30. Unknown space. Unknown factions. Limited fuel reserves. 1 flagship and partial escort fleet. No resupply routes. No political leverage. No intelligence. He felt something adjacent to excitement. The other vessel, he said. The Hyperion. Present and accounted for. Admiral Young's ship appears to have made the transit simultaneously. Of course it had. The universe had a sense of the theatrical, or perhaps the force, that governed such things simply. Understood that Reinhard von Lohengram without Yang Wenli in the equation was only half a story. Establish communication with Yang, Reinhard said, and someone find out what that station is. I want to know who commands it, what military force it represents, and whether that force is worth either fearing or dismissing. He turned back to the view screen, studying the wheel-shaped station with the same expression. A master chess player gives a new board. Somewhere in that station, he suspected, someone was studying him with equal intensity. He found himself hoping they were intelligent enough to make this interesting. If you want to see more legendary characters cross into new galaxies, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Yang Wenli was drinking tea when the Federation made first contact. This was not unusual. Yang Wenli drank tea during battles, during retreats, during the signing of armistices, and presumably would drink tea during his own funeral if logistics permitted. The Hyperion's small offices. Mess had been commandeered. As his thinking space, a habit his crew had long since stopped questioning, and he sat with his battered cup cradled in both hands, staring at the star charts his navigation team had spent the last 2 hours constructing from scratch and thinking about the nature of impossible situations. He had been in impossible situations before. He had won most of them, which he considered largely a matter of luck and his opponents. Occasional stupidity rather than any particular genius on his part. His subordinates disagreed violently with this assessment. Young had learned to stop arguing about it. The situation as he understood it. 1 transit through an anomalous warp corridor during the final engagement at Vermilion. 1 inexplicable arrival in uncharted space. 1 very large space station of unfamiliar design now attempting to communicate on 17 different frequencies simultaneously, which suggested either desperation or thoroughness. And Yang was inclined to think thoroughness, which meant whoever commanded that station was methodical. Methodical commanders were either very dangerous or very reasonable. Sometimes both. And somewhere off his port bow, Reinhard von Lohengram was undoubtedly already forming a plan. That, more than the unknown star charts, was what made Yang set down his tea. Lieutenant Frederica, he said. And his aide materialized, with the quiet competence that Yang had come to rely on so completely he occasionally forgot it wasn't simply a feature of the universe. Has Admiral von Lohengram's ship attempted communication with us? A coded channel opened 12 minutes ago, sir. Standard Imperial encryption. And the Admiral requests a joint communication session with whatever authority commands the station. He suggests presenting a unified front. Frederica paused. He also notes, in what I believe is meant to be a reassuring postscript, that he has no intention of engaging the station militarily at this time. At this time, Young repeated, in the tone of a man reading very fine print on a very concerning contract. He picked up his tea again. Tell Reinhard I'll join the channel. But I want our own independent communication line to the station as well. Parallel, not subordinate. Frederica allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Anticipating divergent objectives, Admiral. I'm anticipating Reinhard being Reinhard, Young said. Which is essentially the same thing. Benjamin Sisko had negotiated with changelings wearing human faces. with Cardassian prefects who considered deception a social grace, and with the prophets themselves, who communicated exclusively in metaphor and baseball. He considered himself a reasonably accomplished reader of people. The two men now occupying his view screen were the most difficult individuals. He had attempted to read in 20 years of service. The universal translator had cracked the language barrier with remarkable speed. The underlying grammar shared enough structural DNA with several known languages that the universal translator had bootstrapped a working vocabulary. Within 40 minutes, though nuances were still rough, what came through clearly enough was everything that mattered. The younger man, impossibly young for the bearing he carried, had introduced himself as Fleet Admiral Reinhard von Lohengrin. He sat in his command chair the way Sisko imagined ancient emperors sat on thrones, not performing authority but simply being it, the way certain people are tall or blue-eyed, golden-haired, sharp-featured, with eyes the color of glacial ice that were currently conducting what Sisko could only describe as a tactical survey of his face. Captain Sisko. Reinhard's translated voice carried an accent the universal translator hadn't quite smoothed out, giving it an archaic formality that Sisko found unexpectedly compelling. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending we arrived here intentionally. We did not. I will also not insult your intelligence by pretending this conversation is purely social. It is not. What I would like to establish, with reasonable efficiency, is whether your Federation represents a threat, an opportunity, or simply a logistical complication. Dax, standing at Sisko's shoulder, murmured very quietly, I like him. The second man, Yang Wen-Li, who had identified himself from what appeared to be a separate channel as a fleet Admiral of the Free Planets Alliance, a designation that Sisko's staff were still trying to reconcile with. Reinhard's imperial credentials was almost a deliberate contrast. Older, rumpled, with dark eyes that held the particular expression of a man who has seen too much and decided to find it gently amusing rather than crushing. He was holding a cup of something. He had been holding it for the entire conversation. What Admiral von Lohengrin means, Young said, with the ease of a man who had been translating Reinhard's ambitions into human language for years, is that we'd appreciate knowing where we are, whether you intend to shoot at us, and whether there's any chance of a resupply arrangement. We are low on fuel and my crew hasn't had a decent meal since Vermilion. Sisko looked between the two men for a long moment. Two military commanders from the same apparent origin point, communicating from separate ships on separate channels, presenting a unified front. That was nevertheless very clearly two distinct agendas wearing the same coat. He had dealt with the Cardassian Dominion Alliance. He understood coalition dynamics. You're near Deep Space Nine, he said carefully. In Federation space, the United Federation of Planets, 150 member worlds, operating under a charter of mutual defense and peaceful exploration. He paused deliberately. We don't intend to shoot at you, but I'd appreciate your weapons staying powered down while we talk. Reinhard's expression didn't change. Our weapons are already powered down, Captain. We powered them down 11 minutes ago. A beat. We were curious whether you'd noticed. Worf, behind Sisko, made a sound that in a Klingon was the equivalent of a respectful growl. Sisko filed that away. If Worf was impressed, these men were operating at a level worth taking very seriously. We noticed, Sisko said flatly, and let the ghost of a smile follow it. Come aboard. Both of you. I think we have a great deal to discuss. Young finally took a sip of his tea. Finally, he said, to no one in particular. A reasonable man. The wardroom of Deep Space Nine had hosted Dominion negotiators, Romulan senators, and on one memorable occasion, a Bajoran religious delegation that had rearranged all the furniture to align with their spiritual meridians. It had never hosted anything quite like this. Reinhard von Lohengrin sat at the head of the table, not the chair Sisko had indicated, but the one opposite it. which placed him with his back to the wall and a sight line to every entrance. He had done it without apparent thought, the way a man breathes. Young Wenli had taken a chair slightly to the side, angled so he could observe both Reinhard and the Starfleet officers simultaneously, and had immediately requested something hot to drink. Dr. Bashir had produced Darjeeling from somewhere in the replicator's obscure archives, and Young had accepted it with the reverence of a man reunited with a lost religion. Sisko had brought Dax, Worf, Kira, and Admiral Ross, who had been on the station for a quarterly review and was now very firmly not leaving. The Starfleet officers arranged themselves across the table with a careful positioning of people who were trying not to look like they were positioning themselves tactically. Reinhard noticed. His expression suggested he found this endearing. The briefing that followed lasted 3 hours. What emerged, stripped of its more astonishing implications, was this: Reinhard and Young had come from a civilization that had been at war with itself for over a century. A human civilization, impossibly, recognizably human, descended from Earth colonists, who had spread across the stars under different political structures and fractured into the Galactic Empire and the Free Planets Alliance. Two systems of governance locked in perpetual conflict, bleeding themselves across 1,000 star systems, until two extraordinary men on opposite sides had begun, through genius and circumstance and a great deal of tragedy, to force the question of whether the war needed to end. "You were enemies," Kira said, at one point, looking between them. "We are enemies," Reinhard said, with precise calm. "We are complicated," Young amended, in the same breath. They looked at each other for a moment across the table. Something passed between them that Dax, 300 years old and a scientist of sentient behavior, couldn't entirely classify. It was not friendship. It was not enmity. It was the relationship that forms between two minds that have defined each other so completely that neither knows quite who they would be without the opposition. "Remarkable," she murmured to Sisko, very quietly. Said Sisko. Who was watching? Reinhard watched everything in the room, simultaneously and thinking about the fact that the young Admiral had, without making any visible effort, already identified the station's 3 most structurally significant junctions and was periodically glancing at the power conduits along the ceiling. The man was mapping the station automatically, instinctively, the way other people tap their fingers. The strategic situation presented itself 4 days later, with the particular bad timing that the universe reserves for moments of maximum inconvenience. A Dominion splinter fleet, holdouts from the war who had never accepted the ceasefire, operating under a Vorta administrator, who had apparently not received the memo about the founder's surrender, or had received it and chosen to disagree, had been raiding Federation supply convoys along the Cardassian border. 3 convoys lost in 6 weeks. A Starfleet tactical response had been prepared, reviewed, revised, reviewed again, and was currently sitting in Admiral Ross's command queue waiting for a 4th revision because no one could agree on an approach that didn't risk either significant casualties or a diplomatic incident with the Cardassian Dedapar Council. Young Wenli heard about it from Bashir over tea on the 3rd day, in the way that Young had of extracting information from people through no apparent mechanism other than being quietly interested in them, and spent approximately 40 minutes thinking about it before requesting a meeting with Sisko. He arrived with a single sheet of paper, handwritten. Sisko stared at it. "You still use paper?" "I think better with paper," Young said apologetically. "The diagrams are rough, but the principle should be clear." The principle was, in fact, extraordinarily clear. Young had sketched a 3-phase intercept pattern that used the convoy routes themselves as bait, not a trap exactly, but a redirection, turning the Dominion fleet's own aggressive posture into the mechanism of its encirclement. It required precise timing, a willingness to accept apparent vulnerability in the convoy vessels for approximately 11 minutes. and a detailed understanding of how Jem'Hadar, tactical doctrine, prioritize targets. How do you know how Jem'Hadar prioritize targets? Kira asked, when the senior staff had assembled to review the proposal. You've been here less than a week. I read the tactical reports from the Dominion War, Yang said. Admiral Ross was kind enough to share them. Ross looked faintly uncomfortable. I shared them as background context. They were very instructive. Yang took a sip of tea. The Jem'Hadar are extraordinary soldiers. Fearless, disciplined, physically formidable. But their tactical doctrine is built around certainty of victory. They press advantages aggressively, and they're not accustomed to situations where their advantage is ambiguous. If the convoy appears damaged but functional, their doctrine suggests they'll pursue rather than consolidate. That's the 11 minutes. Worf studied the diagram. His expression was the expression of a warrior encountering a weapon he hadn't seen before and immediately wanting one. This would work, he said, with Klingon directness. It should work, Yang corrected, mildly. There's a difference. I'm unfamiliar with the precise warp capabilities of your vessel types, and I've made assumptions about Jem'Hadar response time that may be slightly off. I'd want to review the plan with whoever commands your tactical wing before committing to the timing. And if Reinhard had proposed this? Dax asked, with the particular scientific curiosity of someone running an experiment. Yang smiled. It was a small, genuine smile that carried within it the weight of 100 battles. Reinhard would have proposed something faster, more aggressive, more brilliant, and significantly more likely to either work spectacularly or fail catastrophically, with very little middle ground. He paused. I would have spent 3 days arguing him towards something more conservative. He would have spent 3 days arguing me towards something more decisive, and we'd have arrived at roughly this. Except we'd both be exhausted and he'd claim credit for the conservative elements while I claimed credit for the decisive ones. Silence around the table. Then Sisko laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him. How long have you two been doing this? Too long, Yang said pleasantly. Not long enough. Reinhard's proposal, presented separately and without coordination an hour later, was faster, more aggressive, more brilliant, and significantly more likely to either work spectacularly or fail catastrophically. Sisko looked between the two documents for a long moment. Get them in the same room, he told Dax, and someone bring more tea. The combined proposal that emerged from 14 hours of what Sisko's senior staff diplomatically called collaborative strategic planning, and what the wardroom's wall, which now bore 3 dent marks at approximately Reinhard's shoulder height, more accurately documented as something else entirely, was a thing of uncomfortable brilliance. It worked. The Dominion splinter fleet walked into Yang's 11-minute window with the precision of a textbook exercise, pursued the apparently damaged convoy freighters exactly as predicted, and found Reinhard's intercept formation, waiting for them with the particular patience of a predator that has stopped pretending it isn't one. The engagement lasted 23 minutes. No Federation vessels lost. The Vorder administrator, who had refused the ceasefire, was now in a holding cell on DS9, contemplating the consequences of poor strategic decisions. Admiral Ross filed his after-action report with the careful language of a man who understood that Starfleet Command was going to have a great many questions about how a border crisis that had defeated 4 tactical proposals had been resolved by 2 admirals from a parallel universe over tea and a dented wall. He used the phrase unconventional allied consultation 4 times. He considered it one of his finer pieces of bureaucratic literature. The victory changed things. Not immediately. Nothing important changes immediately, but in the way that a stone thrown into still water changes things. The ripples moving outward in directions that couldn't be entirely predicted or controlled. Starfleet Command wanted to meet them. The Klingon High Council sent a formal inquiry. Chancellor Martok, whose instincts for genuine warriors were as reliable as any sensor array, had read Worf's tactical assessment of the engagement and dispatched a message that was, by Klingon diplomatic standards, practically effusive in its interest. The Cardassian Dedapa Council registered a formal protest about military action near their border that lasted exactly as long as it took someone to explain that the action had eliminated a Dominion force that had been raiding Cardassian shipping as well. The protest was quietly withdrawn and replaced with a request for bilateral discussion. And Reinhard von Lohengram stood at the viewport of his assigned quarters on DS9, watching the stars he didn't recognize, and felt the thing he had always felt when victory cleared the immediate horizon, the hunger for what came next. He had been in his quarters for an hour when Yang knocked. Not chimed, knocked. With his knuckles, in the old-fashioned way that Yang persisted in despite the existence of perfectly functional door chimes. Because Yang Wenli was quietly, persistently, deliberately old-fashioned in ways that Reinhard had long since given up trying to modernize. Come in, Yang. You always know it's me. You're the only person on this station who knocks. Reinhard didn't turn from the viewport, and the only person whose presence I haven't found either threatening or uninteresting. Yang settled into a chair with the boneless ease of a man whose body has long since made peace with chronic exhaustion. He had tea. He always had tea. Reinhard suspected Yang had a tea production facility concealed somewhere on his person. You've been thinking about the Federation, Yang said. I'm always thinking. You've been thinking about the Federation specifically. A pause. The Council. The way power is distributed. The inefficiencies. Reinhard was quiet for a moment. Then, because this was Yang, and lying to Yang was both pointless and somehow disrespectful. 150 worlds governed by committee. Consensus-based decision-making in a galaxy that contains the Dominion, the Borg, and at minimum a dozen other existential threats they haven't encountered yet. Do you know what their greatest tactical vulnerability is? I suspect you'll tell me. They're brilliant at survival. The Dominion War should have destroyed them and it didn't, which speaks to an extraordinary underlying resilience. But their command structure. Reinhard's voice carried the particular intensity he reserved for problems that genuinely interested him. Their command structure cannot make a decisive decision in under 72 hours. Committees require consensus. Consensus requires debate. Debate requires time. And in a genuine strategic emergency, time is the one resource you cannot replicate. That's a legitimate critique, Yang said carefully. It's a fatal flaw. Reinhard. I'm not proposing anything. The words came too quickly, which meant he was proposing something, at least to himself, at least in the architecture of possibility that his mind constructed automatically around any strategic situation. I'm observing. Yang looked at him for a long moment. Yang's eyes, in these moments, were very quiet and very serious and carried within them the weight of a man who had watched Reinhard's ambition reshape an entire galaxy and understood, better than anyone alive, both its magnificence and its cost. We are guests here, Yang said. We have no ship sufficient to return home. We have no political standing, no supply lines, no institutional support. We are, in the most technical sense, refugees. We are admirals. We are admirals without a war. Yang took a sip of tea, which historically is when admirals become most dangerous, to everyone, including themselves. Reinhard turned from the viewport. He looked at Yang the way he always looked at him, as the one obstacle his mind could never fully reduce to a tactical problem, the one variable that never resolved cleanly into a solution. It was the thing about Yang that he respected most and found most infuriating. The Klingons have invited us to QNOS, Reinhard said. Chancellor Martok wants to discuss the engagement. I heard. A warrior culture with an honorable tradition, a powerful fleet, and a political relationship with the Federation that is allied but independent. Reinhard's voice was perfectly neutral. Interesting people to know. Reinhard. Yang set down his tea. This was serious. Young only sat down. His tea when something required his complete and unencumbered attention. What are you planning? A long silence. Outside the viewport, the wormhole pulsed once, blue-white, like a slow heartbeat. Nothing yet, Reinhard said finally. I'm still gathering information. Which was, Young reflected, precisely what Reinhard said in the strategic planning sessions that preceded his most sweeping campaigns, the ones that had ended with thrones changing hands and galaxies reorganized around a single young man's vision of what order should look like. He picked his tea back up. He was going to need it. 3 days later, Garrick requested a private meeting with Yang Wenli, the former Cardassian spy, now operating as DS9's Taylor, with the elaborate innocence of a man who wanted very much for you to believe he was just a Taylor, arrived at Young's quarters with a suit fitting as his stated pretext and approximately 17 ulterior motives as his actual agenda. Young, who had spent decades operating in political environments where everyone in the room had at least 2 agendas and their furniture probably had one, recognized a fellow traveler immediately. You're not here about the suit, Young said. The suit is important, Garrick said pleasantly, producing a measuring tape with the flourish of a man who genuinely loved his cover. But you're right that it's not exclusively why I'm here. He tilted his head. I've been observing your colleague, Admiral von Lohengran. As has everyone. Yes, but most people are observing what he does. I find it more instructive to observe what he wants. Garrick's eyes were very bright and very careful. And what he wants, unless I'm very much mistaken, is to look at this Federation and see not what it is, but what it could be, under better management. Young was quiet. I have some experience, Garrick continued, measuring Young's sleeve with professional attention. With brilliant men who believe that existing power structures are simply inefficiencies, waiting to be corrected. It rarely ends well for the power structures, or, eventually, for the brilliant men. He paused. I thought you might appreciate a second opinion from someone who has seen this particular play performed before. Young looked at the Cardassian tailor who was not just a tailor, and thought about Reinhard standing at the viewport counting the Federation's vulnerabilities, like a man taking inventory of something he intended to eventually own. How much do you know about our history? Young asked. Enough to find it deeply relevant, Garrick said, and enough to be quite worried. Young nodded slowly. Outside, the station hummed around them. 150 worlds of imperfect democracy balanced on the edge of one young emperor's restless ambition. Tell me what you know, Young said, and I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. The battle began, as the worst battles always do, because everyone involved believed they were acting reasonably. The Dominion had sent a second fleet, not a splinter force this time, not holdouts or ideological stragglers operating on outdated orders, but a genuine strategic response, dispatched by founders who had reviewed the destruction of their border raiding group and concluded, with the cold logic of a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the calculus of control, that the unknown variable responsible needed to be eliminated before it could be understood. Jem'Hadar attack ships dropped from warp in a coordinated pattern that bracketed DS9 on 3 axes simultaneously, and for approximately 90 seconds, before Starfleet's defensive systems fully engaged. The station's tactical display looked like the opening movements of an extinction event. Sisko had faced worse odds. He had faced the Dominion at their full strength, had watched Wolf 359 in the collective memory of his Borg assimilation, had stood in the fire of every conceivable military catastrophe the universe had placed in his path. He gave his orders with the steady voice of a man who had decided, some years ago, that panic was simply inefficient. Yes, but most people are observing what he does. I find it more instructive to observe what he wants. Garrick's Eyes were very bright and very careful. And what he wants, unless I'm very much mistaken, is to look at this Federation and see not what it is, but what it could be, under better management. Yang was quiet. I have some experience, Garrick continued, measuring Yang's sleeve with professional attention. With brilliant men who believe that existing power structures are simply inefficiencies, waiting to be corrected. It rarely ends well for the power structures, or, eventually, for the brilliant men. He paused. I thought you might appreciate a second opinion, from someone who has seen this particular play performed before. Young looked at the Cardassian tailor who was not just a tailor, and thought about Reinhard standing at the viewport counting the Federation's vulnerabilities, like a man taking inventory of something he intended to eventually own. How much do you know about our history? Young asked. Enough to find it deeply relevant, Garrick said, and enough to be quite worried. Young nodded slowly. Outside, the station hummed around them. 150 worlds of imperfect democracy balanced on the edge of one young emperor's restless ambition. Tell me what you know, Young said, and I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. The battle began, as the worst battles always do, because everyone involved believed they were acting reasonably. The Dominion had sent a second fleet. Not a splinter force this time, not holdouts or ideological stragglers operating on outdated orders, but a genuine strategic response, dispatched by founders who had reviewed the destruction of their border raiding group and concluded, with the cold logic of a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the calculus of control, that the unknown variable responsible needed to be eliminated before it could be understood. Jem'Hadar attack ships dropped from warp in a coordinated pattern that bracketed DS9 on 3 axes simultaneously, and for approximately 90 seconds, before Starfleet's defensive systems fully engaged. The station's tactical display looked like the opening movements of an extinction event. Sisko had faced worse odds. He had faced the Dominion at their full strength, had watched Wolf 359 in the collective memory of his Borg assimilation, had stood in the fire of every conceivable military catastrophe the universe had placed in his path. He gave his orders with the steady voice of a man who had decided, some years ago, that panic was simply inefficient. What he had not previously experienced was giving his orders, while 2 parallel universe admirals simultaneously commandeered his tactical communication channels to argue with each other. The eastern axis is the primary thrust. Reinhard's voice cut through the channel with the authority of a man who did not recognize the concept of speaking out of turn. Concentrate defensive fire there, break their formation, and the flanking groups become isolated. The eastern axis is a feint, Young replied, from a separate channel, with the patience of a man who had explained this kind of thing many times before. The flanking groups are the primary thrust. The eastern axis is designed to draw defensive concentration. The eastern axis has 40% more ships, which is precisely why it's the feint. Reinhard, you're doing it again. I'm doing what again? Assuming the enemy thinks the way you do. A pause. Brief, but genuine. The Jem'Hadar are not subtle, Reinhard said. Their Vorta commanders are, Young replied. And this particular Vorta has already lost 1 fleet to us. She's adapting. Sisko, who had been listening to this exchange while simultaneously managing a space station under active attack, made a command decision of the kind that his career had prepared him for. He trusted his instincts about which of the 2 men was right, opened a direct channel to Reinhard's ship, and said, very calmly, Admiral von Lohengrin, stand by. Then he opened Young's channel. Admiral Young, your call. Reinhard's silence lasted 4 seconds. It was, everyone who knew him would later agree, the most expensive 4 seconds of his career in terms of what it cost his pride, and he spent it with remarkable grace. Reinhard, Young said quietly, on a private channel between their 2 ships, while the battle arranged itself around them. If I'm wrong, you can reorganize the entire Federation. A longer pause. That's not funny. It's a little funny. Proceed with your assessment. Young's reading of the battle was correct. The eastern axis broke when Starfleet concentrated on the flanking groups, exactly as he had predicted. And the Vorta commanding the operation, her name was Kalana, and she had survived the Dominion war through a combination of intelligence and careful cowardice that Yang recognized as professional pragmatism, executed a tactical withdrawal with the speed of someone who had prepared for failure as thoroughly as she'd prepared for victory. It was not a rout. It was a retreat, which is a different thing entirely. And Yang noted the distinction with the attention he gave to everything that mattered. She'll be back, he told Sisko. In the after-action briefing that convened 40 minutes after the last, Jem'Hadar's ship cleared sensor range. With better information and a revised approach. She's a survivor. Survivors learn. Then we need to end this at the source, Worf said. His voice carried the particular Klingon quality of a man who has been patient for a long time and is making peace with the end of his patience. Agreed, said Reinhard, who had arrived at the briefing with the expression of a man who had accepted being wrong about one tactical assessment and was now extremely motivated to be right about everything else. He placed a hand-drafted star chart on the table. His hand-drafted star charts, the senior staff had learned over the past week, were more detailed and accurate than most computer-generated projections, because Reinhard absorbed spatial information the way other people absorbed oxygen. The Dominion staging area is here, approximately 4 light-years beyond the Cardassian border. A single decisive strike. We don't do single decisive strikes, Kira said flatly. Not across the Cardassian border. Not without Council authorization. Not without. With respect, Major, Reinhard said, in the tone that meant he was about to say something that required either great courage or great arrogance, and he had never been entirely certain which applied to him. Your Council's authorization process requires 72 hours minimum. The Dominion's adaptive cycle is approximately 48. You will always be a day behind. The room went quiet. Because he was right. Everyone in the room knew he was right. The particular silence of people confronting an accurate critique of something they cannot immediately change settled over the briefing table like weather. It was Garak who spoke, from his position near the door. He had been invited by Yang, a choice that had prompted exactly one raised eyebrow from Sisko, and no further comment. Admiral von Lohengram raises a legitimate strategic point, the Cardassian said pleasantly. He has also, in the past 72 hours, had 3 separate conversations with Klingon Chancellor Martok, 2 encrypted communications with a Cardassian Dedapar, council member whose name I recognize from certain historical files, and 1 meeting with a Ferengi trade representative, whose connections to several border system governments are, let us say, extensive. He paused. I raise this not as an accusation but as context. The Admiral is building something. I thought it worth naming. Every eye in the room turned to Reinhard. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. He looked, with the particular clarity of a man who has been caught doing exactly what he intended to be caught, doing once sufficient groundwork was laid, like someone who had been waiting for this moment. A coalition, he said simply, independent of the Federation Council's authorization structure, Klingons, Cardassians, border system representatives, and whatever other parties find the current response framework inadequate, capable of decisive action within 24 hours rather than 72. He looked at Sisko, not against the Federation, alongside it, but not waiting for it. The silence that followed was a different kind. Not the silence of people confronting a difficult truth, but the silence of people confronting a difficult choice. Yang set down his tea. Reinhard, he said. We talked about this. You talked, Reinhard said. I listened carefully and then made my own assessment. That's not what listening means. It's what it means when the person listening is responsible for outcomes. Young looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who has had this argument in 17 different forms across a decade of impossible circumstances, who knows every variation of it, who has won some and lost others, and who is currently calculating which version of the argument applies to this specific moment in this specific room with these specific people watching. Then he looked at Cisco. "Captain," Young said quietly, "what Reinhard is proposing is not inherently wrong. A rapid response coalition with allied but independent authority could genuinely address the structural vulnerability he's identified. The Federation's democratic processes are a strength in peacetime and a limitation in crisis." He paused. "What concerns me is not the coalition. It's who leads it." "I would lead it," Reinhard said, without particular emphasis, the way he stated most things that others would consider audacious. "Temporarily, until the immediate Dominion threat is resolved." Reinhard has led temporary arrangements before, Young told Cisco. He is very good at them. He is also very good at identifying reasons why the temporary arrangement should continue. A little longer, and then a little longer after that, and then. "I united a galaxy," Reinhard said quietly. "I ended 100 years of war." "You did," Young agreed. "At considerable cost. To yourself and to others." He met Reinhard's eyes. "We are not in our galaxy. These are not our people to unite. This is not our war to end." The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. Reinhard was very still. In that stillness, Cisco saw something he hadn't expected to see in the young admiral's face. Not anger, not dismissal, but the particular expression of a man hearing something he already knows, and has been carefully not thinking about. The expression of a wound that hasn't been acknowledged yet. "Then what are we?" Reinhard asked. His voice was very quiet. "If not what we do, what are we?" Young picked up his tea. His hands, Cisco noticed, were not entirely steady. "I don't know yet," Young said. "I've been trying to figure that out since Vermilion." He looked at his cup for a moment. "But I think it might be the most interesting question either of us has ever had to answer." The wormhole pulsed outside the viewport, blue-white, patient, indifferent to the ambitions of admirals, looked between the two men, the emperor, who wanted to fix everything, and the Democrat who was afraid of what fixing everything cost, and made the decision that command had always required him to make. Not the perfect decision, the necessary one. "Admiral von Lohengram," he said, "stand down the coalition framework. For now." He held up a hand before Reinhard could respond. "In exchange, I'm taking your tactical assessment of the Dominion staging area to the Council myself, personally, with your strategic analysis attached." He paused. "I can't promise 72 hours becomes 24, but I can promise someone will actually read what you wrote." Reinhard looked at him for a long moment. The ice-blue eyes conducted their usual survey, measuring, calculating, weighing. Then, with the particular grace of a man who has learned, through long and painful experience, that some battles are won by not fighting them. "Acceptable," he said. "For now." Young exhaled very slowly. "Thank you," he said, to Cisco, in the tone of a man thanking a doctor for a successful surgery. "Don't thank me yet," Cisco said. "The Council meets in 48 hours." He stood. "Someone tell Garrick the suit fitting can wait." The stars beyond Deep Space Nine did not care about the outcomes of admirals. They burned with the patient indifference of things that have existed longer than civilizations, and will exist long after the last flag is lowered and the last treaty signed, and the last brilliant mind finishes arguing about the best way to organize the people beneath them. They had watched empires rise in this galaxy before. They had watched democracies fracture and reform and fracture again. They were not impressed by genius. They were not moved by ambition. They simply burned. Reinhard von Lohengram stood at the viewport of the Brunhild and watched them for a long time after the Council session ended. The session had gone, by any measurable standard, extraordinarily well. Sisko had been true to his word. The tactical assessment had been read, genuinely read, and the Council's response time to the Dominion staging area strike had been reduced to 31 hours, which was not 24 but was not 72 either, and the strike itself had been executed with a precision that dismantled Kalana's operational base before she could complete her adaptive revision. The Dominion splinter threat, for the foreseeable future, was contained. The coalition framework had been quietly dissolved. The Klingon and Cardassian contacts remained. Relationships, unlike frameworks, don't dissolve. Cleanly, but the architecture of independent authority that Reinhard had begun constructing was, for now, returned to blueprint stage. For now. He was aware of the for now. He was always aware of the for now. What surprised him, what he was still, in the privacy of his own mind, processing with the careful attention he gave to genuine surprises, which were rare, was that the awareness didn't feel like strategic patience this time. It felt like something else, something quieter. Yang knocked. Reinhard didn't tell him to come in. He simply stepped back from the viewport, which Yang understood as the invitation it was. They stood together in the dark of the room, watching the stars, and for a while neither of them spoke. This was something they had learned to do across years of impossible proximity, to exist in the same silence without requiring it to become conversation. It was, Reinhard had once thought and never said aloud, the thing he valued most about Yang Wenli and would least easily admit to valuing. Garak came to see me again, Yang said eventually. What did he want? To tell me that he thinks you're the most dangerous person who has ever come through that wormhole. A pause. He meant it as a compliment. I know. He also said, Yang turned his cup in his hands, that in his experience, the most dangerous people are the ones who are capable of choosing not to be, and that watching someone make that choice, genuinely make it rather than defer it, is one of the rarest things is encountered in a life that has not been short on rare things. Reinhard was quiet for a moment. He was watching to see if I would actually stand down, Reinhard said. We all were. Including you. Yang considered this with the honesty that had always been his most disarming quality. I was watching to see what it cost you, he said. Whether you could do it and remain yourself, or whether stepping back would require you to become someone smaller. He looked at the stars. It didn't. That matters, Reinhard. More than the tactical outcome. More than the Council's response time. Reinhard said nothing. Outside, the wormhole pulsed once, its blue-white light filling the viewport for a moment before fading. And in that light, Reinhard's face held something that was neither the imperial mask nor the strategic calculation, but something rarer and more undefended than either. I don't know how to go back, he said. It was not a complaint. It was not self-pity. It was the statement of a fact, offered with the precision he brought to all facts, however uncomfortable. The corridor is gone. Our physics teams have confirmed it. Whatever brought us here, it cannot be reversed with current technology from either universe. He paused. We are here. This is what there is. Yes, Yang said simply. And you're, Reinhard looked at him. You're not devastated by that. I'm not devastated by it, Yang said carefully. But I've spent my entire career fighting for a democratic ideal in a universe that kept trying to kill it. And I've ended up in a galaxy where that ideal, imperfect, slow, frustrating, bureaucratic beyond all reasonable tolerance, is the organizing principle of 150 worlds. He was quiet for a moment. There are worse places to be stranded. Reinhard turned back to the viewport. The stars burned. The station hummed. Somewhere on DS9, Benjamin Sisko was writing a report that would travel to Starfleet Command and, eventually to the Federation Council, recommending that 2 admirals from a parallel universe be granted provisional Allied status, not citizens, not Starfleet officers, but something the Federation's charter had no precise category for yet. Something new. We'll need to be useful, Reinhard said. Or they'll find a reason to be afraid of us. We are already useful, Yang said. The question is what kind of useful we choose to be. A long silence. The comfortable kind. Yang. If we are genuinely staying. Reinhard's voice carried the particular careful quality of a man approaching something he has thought about more than he intends to reveal. I want to understand this galaxy. Not tactically. Fully. The Bajoran faith. The Klingon honor code. The Vulcan philosophy. The Federation's foundational texts. He paused. I spent my life remaking one galaxy. I'd like to understand this one before you get any ideas? Yang suggested gently. The ghost of something crossed Reinhard's face. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated and more genuine. Before I get any ideas, he agreed. Yang nodded. He finished his tea. He set the cup down on Reinhard's desk with the small click of an ending and a beginning arriving at the same moment. I'll ask Garrick to recommend a reading list, he said. He seems to have read everything. Of course he has. I'll also ask Dax. She's 300 years old. She has opinions. Everyone on this station has opinions. That's democracy, Yang said, moving toward the door. Exhausting and irreplaceable. He paused at the threshold, in the habit of a man who has made a career of the last words said at the right moment. Reinhard. Yang. We did well today. Not perfectly, but well. He looked back over his shoulder, and in his dark eyes was the expression that Reinhard had seen across 100 battlefields, the expression that said, I am telling you something true, and I need you to hear it as truth and not as strategy. That's enough. For today, that's enough. He left. Reinhard stood alone in the dark, in a galaxy that wasn't his, orbiting a station shaped like a wheel, watching stars he was only beginning to learn the names of. The empire he had built was somewhere, behind the impossible mathematics of a collapsed corridor, being governed in his absence by people he had trusted with it. The war he had fought was over, or paused, or transformed into something politics would handle now, which was either better or worse depending on your faith in politics. Here, in this place, he was not an emperor. He was not a conqueror. He was not the golden-haired prodigy who had remade a galaxy before 30. He was a man at a viewport, learning the names of stars. It was, he thought, not the worst beginning. Outside, the wormhole pulsed again, blue-white, patient, ancient, indifferent, and the stars of the Alpha Quadrant burned on around Deep Space Nine, making room, as the universe always eventually does, for whatever comes next. May the Force be with you. More stories await. The stars beyond Deep Space Nine did not care about the outcomes of admirals. They burned with the patient indifference of things that have existed longer than civilizations, and will exist long after the last flag is lowered and the last treaty signed, and the last brilliant mind finishes arguing about the best way to organize the people beneath them. They had watched empires rise in this galaxy before. They had watched democracies fracture and reform and fracture again. They were not impressed by genius. They were not moved by ambition. They simply burned. Reinhard von Lohengram stood at the viewport of the Brunhild and watched them for a long time after the council session ended. The session had gone, by any measurable standard, extraordinarily well. Sisko had been true to his word. The tactical assessment had been read, genuinely read, and the council's response time to the Dominion staging area strike had been reduced to 31 hours, which was not 24 but was not 72 either. And the strike itself, had been executed with a precision that dismantled Kalana's operational base before she could complete her adaptive revision. The Dominion splinter threat, for the foreseeable future, was contained. The coalition framework had been quietly dissolved. The Klingon and Cardassian contacts remained. Relationships, unlike frameworks, don't dissolve. Cleanly, but the architecture of independent authority that Reinhard had begun constructing was, for now, returned to blueprint stage. For now. He was aware of the for now. He was always aware of the for now. What surprised him, what he was still, in the privacy of his own mind, processing with the careful attention he gave to genuine surprises, which were rare, was that the awareness didn't feel like strategic patience this time. It felt like something else, something quieter.